Greetings to everyone at Beyond Words 2020. I'm Jeremy Harding. I'm a contributing editor at the London Review of Books. Lockdown has kept us apart, but it's wonderful at least that we can talk, although some of us can't get a haircut, and I apologise to you if I look like something out of Treasure Island or Planet of the Apes. I've known Jérôme Tubiana, or known his work, for more than 10 years now, but I only met him last year at the point that Guantanamo Kid was published in an English translation in the UK. I was delighted to see it doing the rounds, mostly because I knew the story of the protagonist, Mohammed El-Gharani, and I knew that story from Jérôme because Jérôme approached me, having visited Chad, to say that he thought he'd found an ex-Guantanamo detainee with a very interesting story to tell, and that we should go for it. We decided that we'd take the piece, and when it arrived, I was quite surprised to see the byline describing a character I hadn't heard of, or a writer I hadn't heard of, by the name of Mohammed El-Gharani, and only underneath that, and Jérôme Tubiana. That, I think, is typical of the way that Jérôme works. He has a completely democratic relationship with his sources. The point of what he writes is to put the source at the center of the story and also to acknowledge that source. It's as if he were giving back the material he'd recorded to its place or person of origin. So as if to say, here's what we did together. These are your words. This is your story. And it's now out in the world. In the long piece we ran in the LRB, there are only about 15 lines altogether that are Jérôme's words. They're to get us over technicalities or explain a switch in time or a change of place. And the rest are Mohammed's words. And this is largely the case also in Guantanamo Kid, the graphic documentary. Mohammed is the central character. He appears in hundreds and hundreds of frames drawn by Alexandre Franc. His own words account for most of the text, which is long, detailed, and sometimes incredibly shocking. The graphic narrative lights up an area of darkness and makes it bearable for the reader in ways that perhaps it didn't in the original piece in the LRB. Guantanamo was and remains a terrible place, but Mohammed, an innocent young man and yet such a warrior in his way, survived the ordeal. He was eventually released after roughly 8 years in custody. He emerged like an unwanted child. He'd been born in Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis wouldn't have him back, and he ended up in Chad, where he wasn't welcome either. I just want to remind you that the detention center in Guantanamo was opened in January 2002. It's a repository for Muslims detained after 9/11. You may also know that Guantanamo has a strange territorial status. It's a part of Cuba, beyond the jurisdiction on the rest of the island, and it's also beyond reach of US jurisdiction, which means that human rights lawyers in the US have come up against massive obstacles when they've tried to represent Guantanamo detainees. If you think of a tax haven in the Caribbean, you've got close to what it is that Guantanamo is about. It's about unaccountability. Only it's been a haven not for tax evasion, but for illegal detention and interrogation. And it's been going on for 17 years. Since Guantanamo opened, it's held more than 750 detainees. There are still prisoners in this hell. The current number, I think, stands at 40. Most have never been charged, and Guantanamo Kid is about what hell is really like. Guantanamo Kid was well received by the British public for historical reasons. If you go back to 2003 and the destruction of Iraq, Britain was very much involved. It was a key supporter of America's rolling war on terror, as it was called, while France had taken its distance from the Anglo-Saxon-led coalition, you have to remember that Al-Qaeda and everything that followed had its origins in the post-colonial Anglosphere. British journalists, playwrights, human rights advocates, and lawyers were focused on America's widespread rafle across the Muslim majority world, which was backed actually by Britain's security services. And a distinguished British lawyer went on to represent detainees in Guantanamo, and Mohammed was one of them. Almost 1 million protesters marched in Britain against the invasion of Iraq, but they couldn't stop the forward march of American policy. The security services in Pakistan, among other countries, were selling people like Mohammed into captivity for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a head to the Americans. Blood money for 9/11 was good money. It was a business in Muslim countries. And British readers of a book like Guantanamo Kid are still picking over the remains of multiculturalism in Britain. And of course, they respond instinctively to Mohammed's story as a radical injustice. When I first set eyes on Guantanamo Kid, I kind of rediscovered my second nature as a reader. It took me back to my childhood. Comics, as they were called when I was a boy, were very much discouraged. I was not really allowed to read them, except for a series called Classics Illustrated, which came out of America, which used to do these retellings, graphic retellings of classic novels, Dickens, Dumas. It was where I first discovered Victor Hugo. It's where I read Moby Dick for the first time. And I was very surprised and moved in my 30s when I first came across Art Spiegelman and the Holocaust masterpiece Maus, and realized that graphic novels or graphic documentaries were making a huge inroad into publishing. I think Guantanamo Kid stands very much in the Spiegelman tradition. It's where it belongs. And it's clear, isn't it, that in France, graphic novels are really an incredibly important part of the market. They account for 29%, I think, of library loans and roughly 30% of foreign rights sales into other languages. So they're definitely inserted, they're installed, they're here to stay. And at the same time, it turns out they travel well.